So we've covered a huge amount of ground, and I hope it's not been too overwhelming and that you've been pausing, taking your time, taking notes. But we've covered a lot of ground in terms of the type of stories that make the news, what PR can mean, how journalists work, and how to essentially marry your stories, which is what we're going to go on to. But before I jump into the finding the story in your business, which is probably the bit you can't wait to dive straight into, a little bit about etiquette, because one thing I found when I was doing the course, and I was doing the course face to face and talking to people, is a lot of people said that's all brilliant, but I don't know how to approach a journalist. How do they work? What does it, what do we do? What's the etiquette? How do I find a journalist? So this video is going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about how to find journalist contacts, and it's easier than you think. And secondly, I'm going to talk about a bit of etiquette when it comes to what it means in terms of approaching them. I'm not going to go into detail about the pitching and press release because that's in another module. That's going to come in a lot more detail, but I just want to touch upon the very basics when it's like, I've got a great story, who do I give it to, how do I give it to them? Okay, so essentially, how to find a journalist. The beauty of it is you don't have to subscribe to a super expensive directory because Google is your friend. So most journalists now, that when you go to online publications, when you go to regional, local publications or broadcast, their details are quite often online. So if you go to that publication and access the contact us section, so if it's a newspaper, sometimes it's quite low, it's right at the bottom of the footer of the actual website. Go into the contact us section and you'll see editorial contacts, and you'll see sports editor, sub-editor, chief editor, reporter. One thing I would tend to do when you're approaching locally, I would look for a reporter. If it's a big regional publication, they've got different reporters for the area. Obviously, look for the reporter in your area, and I'll tell you why the reporters are a good shout. The editors, think about it this way, they sit at the top of the tree. They have an overview of all the stories, so quite often they're very, very busy and can't answer the phone and can't respond to an email because they're bombarded. So if they're good and they're having a good day, they might forward your email on to a reporter to write up and follow up, etc. Or they might just leave it because they haven't got time. So I would say look for the reporters. I would also say, so that's one way of doing it. Online, it's a very similar thing. So these online trade publications, these niche publications, advice publications, again, you can often see who the reporters are. They're detailed on there. Another good trick I always find is look at the articles that are similar to the kind of thing you're offering, that would be of interest to you, because often what you'd find is you'll see the name of the journalist and they'll be on Twitter and they'll have their contact details. So there's lots of ways and means around going about getting the contacts. So that, I would argue, is probably the easy bit. So if we're all clear on that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of the basic etiquette. So what I find a lot of people, and I should mention this, is they're quite scared of journalists, and I think it's because of all the things I mentioned earlier about them being overworked, underpaid, generally short on time and sometimes short on the phone to you. Just remember, it's totally not personal, and it's just because they are busy. So everything I mentioned about being quite tight when it comes to pitching, being quite concise, all of those things come into play, and all the things I'm going to teach you in the final module, which is finding the story in your business and pitching it to them. That's where it'll really, the puzzle piece will come together, because the idea is journalists, you have to remember, they're like you and I, but they're just busy. It's like with anything. Think about it this way. If someone emailed you in your business and you were blind copied in, you'd probably ignore it. Whereas if someone emails you and your name's Maureen and say, "Hi Maureen, and you can tell it's tailored to you, you're probably more likely to read it. It's simple. So why would a journalist be any different? So a lot of people are still quite intimidated, and I think people think, well, shall I call them? Shall I email them? What's the kind of etiquette? What's the best way? Okay, my best advice is this. As a general rule, I find if you get your pitch written down, and we're going to talk all about how to pitch and make it tight, etc. So don't you worry, you are covered. But if we get your pitch and how to write it down, my advice always is email that to them. In the first instance, email it to them, and hopefully it'll be no shorter than a couple of lines, and possibly a press release if you've got a press release. Or if you just want to sound them out, it'll just be the pitch, which is the brief. This is my story, XYZ, are you interested in hearing more? Now, there's a chance it won't get replied to. And again, quite often it's because a journalist has missed it because they're just busy, or unfortunately it could be that it's not relevant, which you'll come to find out. If you've followed the course, you'll start to realise what's relevant and what's not, so hopefully you should have a much more fine-tuned antenna for realising what is a story for them and what isn't. But essentially, my general rule is write that email to them and send it. Give it a couple of days. If you've not heard back from them in a couple of days, I think it's legitimate if you feel you've pitched the story right, or if you feel that you've ticked those boxes based on the learnings you've gathered in this course, it's totally legitimate to pick up the phone and say, I just wanted to run this past you, and then say to them, hi, I'm from such and such a place. Is it a good time to talk? Or can I run a story past you? Ask that and establish it first. Because if they say yes, but go ahead, you've bought yourself a couple of seconds because they're okay, they're captive, they're not busy, they can listen. If they say no, now's not a good time, then you know not to bombard them and carry on. You know it would be futile. I think the mistake sometimes people make out of nervousness and not knowing is they launch straight into it and they go, hi, I'm from Dogs for You dog training company, and I've got this great story about how I trained my dog and it was wonderful, and but you might not even be speaking to the right reporter, or it might be the right reporter and they're about to go into an editorial meeting. So the first thing to do is say, I just want to run a story past you. Then the beauty of having emailed them already a couple of days ago, which they may or may not have seen, is that have that email in front of you ready. And I'll tell you why. When you get on the phone to them and you're a bag of nerves, it really helps to have the pitch ready to reiterate to them over the phone. It's up to you to say, I sent it a couple of days ago, or not mention that at all, but have your pitch ready. And the beauty of it is all that pitch acts as your script. And given the fact that the journalist is so short on time and so overrun with different things, you've got a tight pitch rather than getting tongue-tied on the phone having to explain the story again. So the idea is, so like I say, other people might say differently, but my view is start with an email, gives you practice getting your pitch tight, and then reiterate it over the phone. Have you not heard back? And if you've done those things and done it, quite courteously, made sure they're free to hear it, most often journalists, they're good people. They're not these scary monsters. And actually, if it's not right, I've found in my experience, more often than not, they'll tell you why, unless you caught them on a bad day. But more often than not, they'll say, this doesn't work because we tend to focus on this particular area. We tend to focus on this area of business. So if you have anything relevant, do let me know. And once you've done that once you've got over that and you know the etiquette and you've done that pitch, I will tell you what, it's a lot easier. It only gets easier, and suddenly you have a dialogue with them and it's easier to give them stories. And again, what we're all here for and why you're doing this course, to gain column inches with credibility and get your brand out there. So I hope that was useful in terms of the etiquette. Do take the learnings. We're going to go into a lot more detail now in the next module, but I just want to get clear that Google is your friend, and email, then call, and you can't go far wrong.